over the last year, nobody should ever have had any trouble finding today's speaker. Wherever the debate was the most fierce, be it over water reform, prisons, or the ongoing efforts to solve our budget woes, Senator Darrell Steinberg was at the heart of the discussion. He's received kudos for his keen ability to bring disparate parties together, and yes, some condemnation for his willingness to compromise in order to reach accords on those highly charged topics. Now, with the state battling 12% unemployment, he's turned his sights on a collection of more than 24 bills he says can create 140,000 new California jobs. He's joined us today to talk about these issues and, of course, to answer all of your questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome California Senate Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rich, for not only the kind introduction, but for inviting me back again this year. I want to begin with a point of personal privilege, and that is to introduce my mother, who's here with me today, Arlene Steinberg from the Bay Area, and my cousin Naomi Baskin as well. Welcome to both of you. So you think I had pressure last year making this speech with a $42 billion deficit. This year, it's the pressure has been heightened here. Again, this is my second time back, and many differences this year to last. This year, I decided to bring my own teleprompter. It's a Sarah Palin joke. Okay, it didn't go well. Last year, as you recall, I spoke the very week that the Octomom had her 8 children, and that was a big buzz in the news. And so, this year, preparing for this talk, I almost canceled because I actually didn't want to be upstaged by the historic announcement that Zsa Zsa Gabor's husband has decided to run for governor. You might have seen that on the news last night. I need a joke writer. Last February, 1 year ago, I spoke to you after serving in this high office as President Pro Tem for only 2 months. And there really is a big difference between last year and this year. Last February, California's economic future was in real jeopardy. You all know we faced a $42 billion deficit. The bond markets were frozen. We were running out of cash. And the boulder was rolling downhill very fast in a way that would have impacted the ability of cities and counties and school districts to provide services, and would have increased our unemployment rate in a significant way had we not brought resolution to that problem. You can criticize us for many things, but one fact is undeniable. We dealt with it. Both in February and July, the legislature, together with the governor, addressed a $60 billion cumulative deficit. The number itself is still absurd to me. When you consider the fact that the general fund budget just a few years ago was just over $100 billion, and you look at the historic nature and the numbers associated with this crisis, it, to me, is still amazing that we got through it. Forget the ballot measures for a moment. I don't want to talk about those, although I will say, as I said a year ago, that I was proud to help lead Proposition 1F to victory. That was the one that passed, if you recall. A year later, I come before you and we're not out of it, but we are still standing. Personally, for me, it took every bit of patience, every bit of energy, and every bit of problem-solving ability I had to help lead at least one house through this period of time. And at the end of the year, I will say that despite the difficulties, I felt some sense of accomplishment, not only getting through the budget, but overcoming 40 years of state government's inability to comprehensively address California's water crisis. We still have a bond that is before the ballot, but in terms of the underlying policy and thinking about and knowing the regional fights and the history of water in this state, I take a sense of satisfaction on behalf of representative government in California that we got that done and got it done successfully. But I will say that while I carried some sense of satisfaction through 1 year in this job, I will also say that it was the first year in 15 years of public service that I did not enjoy. I didn't enjoy it because the nature of the decision-making itself was mostly very negative. We cut over $32 billion of vital services, from mental health to in-home supportive services to health care for children to higher education to K-12 education. And that's certainly not what I ran for office to do. But John Vasconcellos, I repeat it as many times as I can, always said to me, it is much more fun to serve during the good times, but it is perhaps much more important to serve during the difficult and bad times. And certainly last year was the latter. So after a little bit of rest and being back in the fray now for a month or so, I'd like to spend the next few minutes not trying to parrot David Letterman or Bill Lockyer, but my top 5 lessons learned from my first time around the track. Number 1, as an individual member, you can be a partisan and still achieve big individual goals. As a leader of 25 members, or a leader of 40 members, the entire membership of the Senate, you have to be fiercely partisan at election time. There are proper times to have a big fight over values, over what matters to the future of California, but I am convinced, and I say this as someone who comes from the left part of the political spectrum, that progress is almost always accomplished down the middle. As the majority party, we have the ability to steer a little bit to the left, but frankly, not that much. Look at water as the prime example. I'm not in love with the idea of big dams. And I'm not in love with the idea of spending billions of taxpayer dollars, potentially, to help fund those dams. And yet, I recognized, as most of my colleagues recognized, that if we were going to overcome the 40 years of dysfunction, the 40 years of an inability to get something done, we were going to have to make trades. If we wanted billions of dollars to restore the health of the Delta ecosystem, then we were going to have to give on the storage issue. If we wanted to make sure that there was some better process in place to ensure whether or not a peripheral canal is eventually built or not, we were going to have to acknowledge the fact, as Northern Californians, that in fact, that might be a possibility. The only way that got done, just as the only way most big things get done in representative government, is if you're willing to get out of your own comfort zone, recognizing that you have a line, but willing to get out of your own comfort zone and make compromises that allow you to walk away with a big victory for what you believe in. That's number 1. Number 2, this is for Mr. Skelton. No more all-nighters. No more all-nighters. I had more sleepovers last year than my 15-year-old daughter, and I don't like it. Except for a natural disaster, what can be done at 4 o'clock in the morning can be done at noon or at 2 in the afternoon. There is nothing wrong with a little calm and a little deliberation as we consider the very important issues that come before us. Number 3, we have huge challenges. A fiscal and governance system in big need of change. All of the things that you write and talk about are in order and are true. But I also think, for my number 3, a little perspective is in order as well. I'll save my speech for next time about the state of the United States Congress. But look at the New York legislature. Since December 2009, the former state Senate leader was convicted on 2 corruption counts. A state senator was convicted in October 2009 of taking a broken glass and slashing his girlfriend. Last week, he was kicked out of the Senate. In June 2009, 2 Democratic senators switched their support to a Republican who was seeking the leadership post, causing a 5-week deadlock in the Senate that included locking the chambers and not letting anybody in. The 2 individuals then switched back and backed the Democratic leadership. An assemblyman resigned in June 2009 and was later convicted and sentenced to fraud. A Brooklyn senator was indicted in May 2009 on assault charges. Now, that's pretty extreme. But I ask this in a serious vein. Is any legislative body in this country popular right now, given the kinds of things that we have to do on the budget side especially? We're not exactly the promoters of good news here in California or in any other states throughout the union. We are cutting budgets, and in some rare instances, we're raising taxes. Necessary, but not popular. But when I look at how California faced up to what we had to deal with last year, and I compare it to some of what goes on in other states in the country and in the country itself, I have a little bit of comfort. Number 4, it is better to underpromise and deliver than to overpromise and to fail to deliver. The mood is ugly right now. That's no surprise. People want tangible results, and they will measure us by the only way they should measure us, whether or not we actually get things done that improve their lives. And so jobs is the great word of the day. And there would be a tendency, and in fact there is a tendency, for political bodies to promise the world. We could have put forward our jobs package, and I could have called it the Heal the World Jobs Package. I could tell you that we have the plan to save California, that we're going to bring the economy roaring back, that these ideas are better than anybody else's ideas. But we decided to take, in a deliberate way, a little bit more of a low-key approach. A low-key approach, I asked my team and my members to come up with 25 or so ideas that don't involve new taxes, that involve getting out the money we have in a faster and more strategic and more effective way, to streamline permitting of projects that are eligible for federal funds, to look at our tax credit law and ask the simple question, if one tax credit isn't creating jobs, is there a way we can replace that tax credit with something that might create jobs? And so we've put forward 27 pieces of legislation that can be passed by a majority vote, although we seek to work with our Republican colleagues and, of course, with the governor. And we're talking a little bit about it, but mostly we're just moving it. We moved 2 bills off the floor yesterday. We're moving another half dozen or so through committees today and tomorrow. for the floor next week over to the Assembly, and we intend to put as many of these bills on the governor's desk in the special session first, and then at least out of the Senate by the 15th of April for all of the remaining bills. We estimate, based upon conservative numbers, that getting that money out the door for projects where they have the permits or they're very close to getting the permits will result over the course of the next 2 years in the creation or the retention of about 140,000 jobs. Now, that's not the be-all and end-all of the world, but it's important. And rather than engage in the ideological debate about whether or not climate change exists, whether or not we ought to roll back worker safety laws, whether or not tort reform, ought to be the law of California, we're focusing on what we know we can get done and what we can get done in a short period of time. If we want to convince people to change our Constitution, if we want to convince people to make big changes, whether it's the 2/3 rule, whether it's the way we finance state and local government, whether it's tax reform, we have to produce positive results consistently. And that's what excited me about the water deal, again, to go back to that, and Race to the Top, which was unpopular in some quarters, the education measure that we passed, where hopefully we're going to get close to $1 billion from the federal government as a result of innovating. Tangible, real, get it done, move on to the next one. Number 5, focus on the moment, but have the long view. Elections come every 2 years, but the task to fix California, we know, will be much, much longer. Robert Penn Warren said, and I think it's a quote that really struck me, "History knows no jumps, except the jump backwards, maybe." We have to start now. This year, we have to finish our budget work. We still face a $19.9 billion deficit. We're fighting for $2 to $3 to $4 billion from the federal government. We're going to address $5 to $6 billion of the deficit over the next week. If John Chung's numbers continue and the $1.2 billion revenue increase above what was projected for January continues, even in a more modest way, we could see a $2 to $3 billion bump come the May revise. When I do the math and I add up those kinds of numbers, we can winnow this deficit down to $7, $8, or $9 billion. Now, that still isn't going to be easy. That still isn't going to be pleasant or fun. That still isn't going to be without pain. But when you go back to the number 60, and then you start this year with 19.9 and potentially growing, take one bite of the elephant at a time, and we will get this done. Number 2, we need to pass a series of jobs bills, not just those that are encompassed in our Agenda 2010, that comprise a genuine high-wage job strategy for California that has us poised for recovery, and that does a better job of linking public education and economic development. We ought to be poised to bring back career tech ed again when the economy improves. We ought to be looking, as I suggest in one of the bills in our package, one of the bills that I'm authoring, that maybe it's time to take a look at some parts of, for example, the Enterprise Zone program, which the PPIC has told us is not producing the kind of jobs that were promised, and take $60 or $70 million of that and replace it with a tax credit for businesses that are willing to engage in career partnerships with public educators and public school districts and reward them for doing the right thing by their futures, but the right thing by too many kids' futures who otherwise end up as dropout statistics. Number 3, let's take constitutional reform where we can find it. We all know what occurred with the Constitutional Convention and the fact that they didn't have the money. I know my dear friend Bob Hertzberg is still out there working hard, trying to hustle Cal forward. I'd like to put Cal forward before us, the legislature. I'm not sure that there's a 2/3 vote to amend any part of the 2/3 rule. And of course, the great irony of our system is that representative government cannot even suggest constitutional change without a 2/3 vote to even give the question to the people. But here's one thing we could do on a bipartisan basis. Senator Cheney has a constitutional amendment that would require any future initiative to actually have a funding source if it's going to spend the public's money. Common sense, great idea. We're going to move that forward early in the session. 4, you've heard a lot of talk about oversight. We're doing 2 things in this area that I think are significant. Number 1, I've asked every committee chair in the Senate to take a look at the 5 biggest programs or bills in their area that have been put in place over the last 5 years, and to hold oversight hearings on those measures between now and June the 1st. Because the word oversight is amorphous to too many, but what do you mean? How do we do it? What are we looking for? How about we begin spending more time looking at the impact and the performance of the laws we have passed than spending all of our time passing new laws? Secondly, and we have scheduled now 70 scheduled oversight hearings as a result of this directive. In addition, on this federal money and state bond money, we are going to ask our relevant committee chairs to look to see what bottleneck exists in respective state agencies that are making it more difficult than not to get this money out. I conclude with this thought, and I'll be happy to, of course, then take questions. This is the week of the President's holiday, Lincoln in Washington. And I was reading an interesting article in the New York Times on Monday where a writer talked about how in 1783, George Washington was faced with an army threatening to actually seize the government, to seize the Congress by force, because the Congress was delayed in paying wages and pensions to soldiers who had been fighting in the Revolutionary War. Well, Washington calmly sat everybody down, urged a deep breath, a little bit of calm, and suggested a safe venue for the army to press its concerns. Within a short time, the dispute was largely resolved. And the story is cited as one of many chapters of Washington's life where he helped form and save the Union, but this was specifically about how we ended up with civilian control over the military instead of military control over the military. And the principle, of course, was that we need to always focus on making steady decisions to ensure the strength of representative government over panic and hysteria. I think that message is one we all need to think about as we go forward this year and in coming years to restore the great reputation of California. Thank you for having me.
Senator Steinberg is going to take some questions. We don't have a mic today, so I'm just going to come to you and raise your hand, and we'll start with Mr. Walters. We know people remember.
Daryl, you mentioned the streamlining project going on. The government has submitted a rather extensive measure that would allow any administration, not just his, to select projects from a list and fast track them through the process. What's your sense about that?
Well, I'm all for fast tracking. I'm not for waiving the CEQA law. See, I think that gets us into the sort of unproductive ideological debate about whether or not you can have climate change and economic growth at the same time. So last year, as you remember, as we negotiated the February budget, we agreed to a series of CEQA waivers. Some of them actually negotiated Highway 50 and the Caldecott Tunnel projects negotiated in my office, with the promise that the CEQA relief would jumpstart those projects. They haven't exactly started, the vast majority of them. And I would rather us focus on, for example, one-stop shopping for gaining your permits. In the early 90s, Governor Wilson and the legislature had 14 offices throughout the state of California where representatives from various state agencies were present at the same time, or at least with access to those people at the same time, to be able to make sure that a project applicant, a small business, or even a large project could go to one place and get the permits they needed to move forward. I think that's a much better approach than wading into waiving the CEQA law.
And right over here.
Hi,
Judy.
Judy Lynn with the Associated Press. I just wanted to.
If she can't be heard, I'll repeat the question.
The Senate Budget Committee has passed about a little over $5 billion in special session changes, and I wonder if this meets the special session requirements that the governor has called for, because in his budget, my understanding was he wanted to deal with about $8 billion. So how do we address this discrepancy, and does it meet Prop 58's requirements?
Oh, it no doubt meets Prop 58's requirements, which require that we send a credible plan to the governor, and this is certainly that. We intend to make a dent in the deficit. If you look at the governor's January proposal, his current year proposal is only about $1 billion. It's 8.9. You're right, over the 18 months, and so we intend to do a little bit over 5. And I'll tell you why. We talk about where we fight and where we work together. I'm not making any promises, but I am not willing to wade into cutting health and human services and education deeper as our first budget act in 2010. Now, let's see what kind of economic recovery we have. Let's see how big the hole is. Let's see what revenue options there may be. But we've done enough damage. And I'm not happy about it. And I think it's counter, frankly, to economic recovery to continue cutting, because it leads to more people being laid off and more people unable to contribute to the improvement in the economy. I mean, too often we just look at these spreadsheets, but there's a real human impact here. 300,000 lower income women can't get basic breast cancer screening. 500,000 people, poor people, not getting the dental care that they need. The very successful assistance to work program known as CalWorks getting nearly decimated. Tens of thousands of people eligible for and needing in-home service, in-home supportive services, not getting them anymore. I mean, again, I'm proud that we held on to a lot last year. But I'll be darned if I'm going to, as one leader, if I'm going to start this year going down that route. Now that, we'll talk again in June or July. And unlike the other party, I don't sign pledges. I ask my members not to sign pledges because we have a responsibility to govern. We will.
Senator right over here.
Senator Steinberg, we've got congressional, Ray Mines, Capitol Television News. Several congressional Democrats and then the Assembly Speaker here in the state have contributed almost $200,000 toward an effort that I guess is effectively looking to repeal appeal to citizens from the district commission. How do you feel about these Democrats coming together to oppose what seems to be the will of California voters to have that power to draw districts themselves?
I think the real impetus behind that is the Munger Initiative, which would seek to create an independent commission for the redistricting of congressional lines. And that I oppose. I don't think it's necessary. There isn't that same alleged conflict of interest in terms of the state legislature drawing those lines, recognizing that state legislators sometimes run for Congress. I get that. But it isn't the same. And I frankly have some concerns about what we're seeing thus far with the Prop 11 Commission. Are the people who apply representative of California? Do they represent the ethnic, racial, gender, geographic diversity of California? So I think that the upshot of all of it in the end, in my view, will be an effort to try to defeat the Munger Initiative, and I'd be for that.
What are your thoughts on the governor's proposal about using Prop 63 monies to build a gap in mental health?
Been there, done that, not again. No way. I mean, look it. I got criticized, I got some praise, whatever, for willingness to put Prop 63 on the table last year. I felt it was the right thing to do because given the gravity of the crisis, I could not in good conscience say, protect mine, but cut everything else. And so we did it, and it was painful. And we did the same thing with Prop 10. But, the voters spoke. Now, some might say, well, the voters rejected all the propositions because of the tax increase and the extension of the taxes for 2 years, and that may be true. But we've been there once and done that. I'm not doing it again. Why would I do that, agree to that, when the other side has clearly said, the governor has clearly said he won't sign simple 3% withholding for businesses to raise $1.4 billion. Why would I cut more mental health services? Been there, done it.
Oh, right back here, Senator. That would be you.
I'm so glad you mentioned the $1.4 billion. I'm having a hard time understanding it. Kathy Beasley, I own my own business, so I'm an independent contractor. I pay quarterly taxes, as do most people in that kind of position. And as far as I can understand, the only thing you're going to do is cause people who hire me to not really want to hire me anymore. I don't get why it's suddenly more money. When we pay quarterly taxes, it's based on how much money we're making, and we send it to the government. So what are you going to get it a month by month instead of quarterly? I mean, why?
Well, what? Yeah, the question is why suggest this independent contractor withholding when many small businesses already pay their taxes quarterly? Because not all do. And at the end, you get a lot of independent contractors get their 1099 at the end of the year. And all we're seeking to do, and by the way, the LA Times reported yesterday, and accurately, we probably won't put this forward as part of the February budget, but it will remain a live option come June or July. All we're saying is that the same principle that applies to working people ought to apply to businesses. And again, it's not something that I would care to take on as a matter of policy, because I won't stand here and tell you that it's a great thing. But no proposal, no matter how flawed it may be, can or should be seen in isolation. It has to be compared with what else you might do. And so when I'm honest, I look at the $1.4 billion, and I say $1.4 billion fewer cuts to education, higher education, services for the elderly and disabled. And it's not an increase in taxes.
So it's not an increase in revenue either.
It is a one-time increase in revenue of about $1.4 billion, and then the franchise, not my numbers, Franchise Tax Board, and then the Franchise Tax Board tells us that there is an ongoing revenue benefit of about $100 million a year, because what you end up doing is collecting the taxes for those scofflaws in the end who don't pay any taxes at all, the so-called underground economy. So there is a revenue benefit, one time that's big and ongoing that is modest but real. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's better than some of the other choices. Hi, John.
I can yell across the room.
Yes, John.
Daryl, John Myers, KQED Public Radio. Could you talk about for a moment your bill this week that we've been discussing about the furloughs and modifications to the furlough policy, and specifically focused obviously on the tax-generating agencies and trying to recoup money. While the governor did put forward the executive order, the dollar figure for the savings of those furloughs was in the budget that the legislature approved. And so I guess I would ask, in retrospect, do you wish you hadn't put that number in there? Do you wish you had fought for that differently? I mean, in other words, did it turn out to be worse than you thought it was going to be?
Well, first of all, we did fight for it. We did fight for it because, as you remember, for example, we had, as part of our Big Five agreement last February, not only the revenue that we ended up passing and the governor ended up signing, but close to $2 billion worth of additional excise tax that Senator Maldonado negotiated out of the deal. Now, if we had gained that, we might have been able to make some other choices. So we agreed to an overall number for state employee compensation that I wasn't happy about, but that was necessary. Now, what was missing, though, what's missing here is a clear reading of the law. The Labor Relations Act, the Labor Relations Act of California, which says that when it comes to wages, benefits, and terms and conditions of employment, that a governor needs to sit down and negotiate in good faith. And what we object to, and what I object to with the furlough policy, and I think it's borne out by the numbers that have been produced by our office here, is that when you go it alone, when you act unilaterally, when you don't consult with the people on the front lines, you often get a bad result. I mean, why would you apply this furlough policy to the franchise tax board that is in charge of collecting revenue for the state? No one's disputed, as far as I know. I haven't heard the administration dispute that the that the $65 million saved in salary is costing us, just by virtue of the franchise tax board furloughs, $465 million, because we can't now as aggressively audit to gain the tax money that is owed. And it isn't as though the unions don't get it to some degree. If you look at what SEIU Local 1000 did last year, they negotiated a day of furlough. And then the economy got worse. And we're all going to have to account for the numbers. There's no question about it. But it's how you go about it. It's management. And in this case, when we are talking about precious mental health programs, when we're talking about health insurance for kids, when we're talking about 32% fee increases for people at the kids at the University of California, I don't think we can afford to lose $400 million because we allowed a furlough program to go forward that wasn't well thought out.
Could I just follow up quickly, just to understand? I mean, given that you agreed to the dollar amount,
yes,
would you have liked it? Where else would it have happened? I guess, I think the governor fairly telegraphed what he was going to do with the furlough policy. I know you wanted him to go to negotiation. I don't know that I ever heard him say to do that. So,
what I would want him to sit down, and the unions would have to agree to some concessions as part of those negotiations. No question. There's no money. We have no money. The number that he seeks to get out of that particular line item, you never really heard us argue with in the end. I mean, we do have disagreements because we think, geez, if you did some of the majority vote revenue proposals, or if you agreed to, a broader based tax that would bring more revenue in, then you wouldn't need to do all that. But the number's the number.
Julie Bauer, County PA Officer, Internal Communications Editor. I would like to know if there's a full appreciation for the ability of special funded agencies to raise money for the state. Because I know that in our case, we have the ability. And I know that if you gave us the furloughs back, we might be able to follow a directive that would increase our income.
Well, my bill, let me be clear about my bill, which is before the Senate Appropriations Committee this afternoon. It would end the furloughs immediately for special funded agencies that don't receive more than 5% of their funding from the State General Fund. In addition, we added the Franchise Tax Board and the Board of Equalization because they're revenue-generating agencies. So we're right on line with you there.
Hi, Marion Ross, Capital Public Radio. We've seen a few lawmakers recently, both at the congressional level and also the legislative level, decide not to run again. Some of the reasons given have been, of course, the partisanship. And the Field poll and DPIC poll are putting legislative approval ratings at pretty low, in the low teens. I'm curious, how worried are you about the confidence in the legislature, the image that the legislature has in California, and how that affects your ability to get things done?
I worry about that every single day. And, you know, I frankly, I love what I do. And yet, you know, sometimes you question, geez, do I want to continue to be, you know, involved in something where people look at you, or at least your institution, in such a negative way? But I only know one response to that, and that is to try to make it better. And the only way I know to make it better is to actually produce, to go back to my comments, to produce on the job front, to produce on the renewable energy front, to produce on the career education, technical education front, to produce on the budget front and get this solved. That's the only way I know how. And then you have to have some faith. So you try to have the long view, as I said earlier. If I'm lucky enough to win re-election and serve for approximately 5 more years in this position, I could see 5 years from now looking back and saying that I was at least a part of helping to turn this around. So that's what keeps me going. And it is frustrating, and you see good people. I mean, this democracy is a funny thing. John Meekum, in this week's Newsweek, the cover column, I don't know if anyone's read it, but it's really worth reading. Because part of what you realize in this business, to state the obvious, is that the system is in large part designed to make things a bit dysfunctional and to go slow. I mean, that's intentional. And yet, and yet, some have said, and I think rightfully so, is there a crisis in governance, nationally and in this state? Of course there is, because while the system is set up to have all these checks and balances, which are a good thing, a lot of problems aren't being solved. Our job is to try to reconcile that in the best way that we can.
We have time for just a few more. We're going to start right here.
Bob President's Capital Morning Report.
Hi.
If you didn't have the 2/3 rule, where would you go for the revenue to protect in-home supportive services and education and the other things that you mentioned?
If we didn't have the 2/3 rule on taxes, for example?
If you didn't have the 2/3 rule and Republican opposition, what areas would you propose going to?
I would do 2 main things. Number one, I would take the kernel of the Parsky work, and I would reform the tax system in a more progressive way, in a way that would lead to more money for education and other vital public services. I would expand the tax base. And second thing that I would do is, and this is part of California Forward, the second initiative that I think is maybe the most important piece of any and all reform, I would give local governments, counties and cities and school districts the ability to affect the revenue side of their equation with less than a 2/3 supermajority vote. And then I would propose a healthy, friendly divorce between state government, local government, and school districts. And the state would still have a role to play in many ways to assure equality, Serrano v. Priest, and all of that. But fundamentally, 32 years after the passage of Prop 13, the entity that raises the money doesn't provide the service. It's no wonder people are frustrated. Who's accountable? You know, I'll give you one, and Alicia probably won't want me to do this one, but I'm doing it anyway. Sorry, Alicia. But it really, as we are debating transit right now, I want to give you one great example. One of the things that we are proposing is to give local transit agencies the ability to impose a per gallon fee to fund transit operation. And there is a nexus because of the climate change bill, AB 32, and my SB 375 that encourages more compact urban planning. And the debate that we're having internally now is whether or not we ought to give elected officials the authority to impose that fee or whether it should go out to a vote of the people. And I'll tell you, in the end, we're going to suggest that it go out for a vote of the people. And yet, it really bugs me. Because you run for office, you ought to have the ability to have the tools, both on the expense side and the revenue side, to be able to fulfill your responsibilities. And that does not exist now in California. And until we grapple fundamentally with aligning resources and responsibilities in a way that's coherent and makes sense to people and allows the people responsible for providing the service to raise the money, I think we're going to continue to be tangled up. Now, the California Forward has presented an interesting idea here that I hope moves forward. But that's what I would do, those two things. Yeah.
You still have the 2/3 vote, however, at the moment.
Yeah.
And you still face a $20 billion budget.
Right. How are we going to do it?
Are you going to propose new taxes of the kind that were passed last year, general tax, sales tax, income tax, anything that you call a general tax? And what prospect, if so, what prospect do you have?
I don't plan to put forward general tax increase. But I'll tell you one thing, because I don't think we'll pass them. I'm not interested in having my hair on fire when it's not going to lead to an actual productive result. But I will tell you, we'll look again at the business tax break side, just as we're doing a little bit this side. I mean, in order to get the $25 billion of taxes last year, we had to give on some tax breaks. And that certainly is an area that I think is ripe for discussion and debate when it comes down to the choices around the final, whatever it's going to be, $7, $8, $9 billion.
You're proposing taxes, and you've kind of drawn the line in the dirt on certain programs. You say you've gone too far.
I said in February. Yeah. No.
How do you do it then? How do you close $20 billion?
You know, I do not have the final answer to that question right now. But we will. We won't allow the state to go over the cliff. There'll be more cuts and there'll be revenue. I mean, that's the simple answer. We'll
final answer, do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
All right.
Speak up.
President Pro Tem Armenta with the Public Policy Institute of California. My question is regarding yesterday's letters that were sent by the governor's office addressed to you and to Speaker Bass on designing the nomination of Senator Maldonado. And
almost got out of here. This close to a clean getaway, as Jack Nicholson would say.
His press release includes both the removal of nomination for the lieutenant governor's post, including the renomination. Now, I'm just wondering if you're going to go about to repeat the process all over again, given that there's a 90-day window that opens up as of yesterday.
Look at, I mean, the Senate, I think, was pretty clear in its direction, and Senator Maldonado's a colleague. And as I said, I think it is important to acknowledge people that are willing to cross over and work with the majority party. And so we had a bipartisan support for his nomination. We did it pretty quickly, quietly, cleanly, no fuss, no muss. Now that he has been renominated, I don't see the Senate's position changing in any way, but I think we ought to see what the Assembly does first before we act. All right? Thank you.